Right, well, can I just ask one or two questioners to make their way to the microphones while I've got one tweet question which I can ask in the meantime. So could we have Nick Bragg, David Fluellen and Millie Wasty making their way to some microphones to ask your questions, please. And in the meantime, the tweet question. Is food getting too expensive, or is it more the case that until recently it was getting too cheap? This is from Essex Peasant, who apparently few people know who that is. I mean, Jay, what do you think?
No, food isn't getting too expensive. There is an issue Mary raised about food poverty. There is an issue with poverty in this country. There is a growing number of people who are being forced into basically destitution by, sorry Jim, a bunch of government policies which are created around deficit reduction but are making things very, very tough. Everything for them is too expensive, including food. In general, though, we are still in a situation where, okay, it's not as cheap as it was in, say, 2006, 2007, but food is still extraordinarily cheap historically. And as I said in my 2 minutes, if we are going to get to a situation where farmers of Britain, can invest in the agricultural base, we're going to have to pay a little bit more.
And do you think that's palatable for consumers? I mean, what do you think, Mary?
Well, I think there's a cost of living crisis that's affecting families up and down the country, and I think there's a squeeze on incomes with incomes remaining stagnant or falling in many cases. And we've seen a big food price spike in 2008 with the commodity price spike that happened in 2008. And I think people are feeling it in their bills, they're feeling it in what they send in their kids' lunchboxes to school. If you have 3 children at school and school dinners go up to £2 a day, that's the £6 a day, £30 a week investment that you may not be able to afford to make. And I think there's a real issue. I've visited several food banks, and they're run by a variety of mostly church-based charities, but also people like Help the Aged, Salvation Army. And what they are starting to see is we have a traditional model of people who use food banks, and it's people who are homeless, people with drug and alcohol problems. That pattern is completely changing, and it is much more now people who are being refused their benefits or who've applied for social fund loans who aren't getting them. So almost 40% of the food bank that I visited on Monday in Harlow, 40% of their clients have actually not got the benefits that they're entitled to. And so it's a squeeze on welfare reform, but it's also much more women with families.
So you're saying it's unacceptable that food prices should go up?
I think in the 7th richest country in the world, it's unacceptable that families are unable to feed their children decently, and that we have schools reporting malnutrition and scurvy in primary-age children after the summer holidays when those children haven't had the free school meals.
Well, Mary, that's all true, but that's about poverty, not necessarily about the situation with food prices. You have to keep those two things in their separate... It's an appalling thing that, I wrote a very big piece about food poverty and food banks, but they are separate issues, and you do have to try and find a way to keep them separate.
Well, yeah, they are separate, but there is a rush to austerity, which is compacting and compounding that. And I think I just want to tell you a very quick story, because when I went to this food bank, they always take tinned and dried goods. And they said, actually, we had this turkey farmer who came to us, and just before Christmas, they had some turkeys left over, and we were able to sort of cut up those birds. They checked with the environmental health, and they cut up those birds so that the people who came to them just before Christmas were able to have turkey on their table. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. And my challenge to the conference today is to think about how you can use surpluses and how you can use stuff that, if the supermarket turns around and says it doesn't want it, think about what you do with that rather than just
Shawn, you wanted to come in briefly.
A quick point. Retail food prices have gone up by about 35% since 2007. And if anyone tells you they're coming down, again, you're in cloud cuckoo land. We now face an era of high food prices, high agricultural prices, and that is why it's absolutely imperative, and why in some respects it's so disgusting that this isn't at the front of the CAP discussion. We have to ensure that we're doing the best we can in the world we're facing into to keep the cost of producing food as low as possible. We've got to make it more affordable than it is today, and the only way we're going to do that is partly, of course, we need the economy to recover and people's incomes to improve, but we need to keep the cost of production as low as possible. As far as I can see, most of the talking that goes on in the CAP is going to raise the cost of production and do very little for the biggest of all social problems, feeding people.
Absolutely right.
Okay, Nick Bragg, first question.
In our semi-rural area, we're finding that children are unaware and how food and where their food is produced. As an industry, how can we get food production and access to the countryside included in the natural curriculum, as they are our next generation of consumers?
Thank you. Jim, so how do we get young people to understand what goes on down at the farm?
By working with, but by the industry working closely with schools, as I've seen happen in some places and was instrumental in opposition in developing the concept of twinning schools, moving away from the idea of an annual visit to a farm because everything looks lovely but the children enjoy the day and it doesn't stick. But if you can build it into, not as a subject in the curriculum, but you build it in as a means of teaching the curriculum so that the basic sciences and mathematics and all the different subjects actually can be built in to the visit. Then the schooling, the subjects, curriculum comes alive for those youngsters. And today you don't have to spend large sums of money taking children to the farms, because with modern digital technology, you can take the farm to the school. Every month you can bring an update of what's happened. Those lambs have grown up, the crops have grown, they've been harvested, ploughed, reseeded, all these things. But it's only by the industry working closely with schools, and some schools will be more amenable to it than others. But you're absolutely right, but I'm convinced that's the only way we're really going to make it happen.
But also, don't young people have to see it as a scientific subject as well, not little Bo Peep type farming, but something where, you know, we've talked so much about R&D being so important, well, you know, to see the potential for scientists going into agriculture.
I entirely agree, but that's really behind my point. School visits go off at this time of the year, or you have lambing Sundays, and everybody goes ooh and ah about these baby lambs. They need to see 3-4 months later when they're first being weighed, and some are going away to be slaughtered, and the process beyond that, and the old ewes that don't conceive next year, and they go off as barreners, and the whole science of growing crops about the fact you sow the seed and you put the fertilizer on and they grow and then you harvest them and the whole cycle starts again. That is science, and that will be instilled into them as a real means of interest, and it's so much more alive than the boring way I was taught it in the school laboratories.
And William, from the young farmer's perspective, I presume this has to be part of your next generation forum.
I mean, absolutely. And we're talking about the consumers of the future and also the workforce in this country of the future. And as you reiterate, as you've pointed to there, farming will embrace all sorts of the working sector, you know, from science to mathematics to vets, etc., and engineering. But going back to the consumers of the future and educating them in the production methods of farming and actually appreciation of how farming is operating. I mean, it's a massive gap there. I mean, I live in a rural area, and you can see that in the kids in our rural area at a young age. I shudder what to think it's like in more central urban areas, perhaps where it doesn't go on as much.
Actually, it's exactly the opposite. Exactly. There's a massive project in London, headed up by Rosie Boycott in the Mayor's office, to get food planted in school playgrounds. My son's school does exactly that. When you say bring the farm to the school, that's what they're doing. I'd have to tell you, it's a technical term, you haven't got a hope in hell of getting Michael Gove to put anything else on the national curriculum. It's not going to happen. But what would surprise me is that any primary school, certainly, would not want to do that and get their kids involved in growing their own food, which is what they do, you know, in my inner city Brixton Primary School on a massive scale. It's all over London. It's very heartening, actually.
Let's take the question from David Fluellen. I'm just seeing that the question from Millie is very similar to we've just been talking about. So I don't know where Millie is, but I think we'll perhaps have to miss your question, because your question was very much along the same lines about educating consumers. Oh, is that mean? Is that really mean of me? Oh, go on then, ask your question, but you'll get the same answers.
Firstly, I'd just like to thank the NFU on behalf of the National Federation of Young Farmers, providing 76 young farmers places here this last 2 days for the conference. Could the young farmers present here today please show their appreciation to the NFU in the usual manner? As young farmers members, we understand the importance of where our food comes from and how to cook it, which is reflected in our annual cookery competition. We are fortunate to have received the Olympics Inspire mark and have planned to stage a cookery demonstration at London 2012, providing healthy British food to the competing athletes. Our 2013 competition theme is the Best of British, and I also represent young farmers at Seizure in Europe on the Promotion of Agriculture work group. Very similar question, but what more can young farmers do to help educate our consumers on where their food comes from and ensure that cookery food science stays on the school curriculum? But what are the panel also doing about this issue?
Well, let's just ask Mary very briefly to come in on this, but we have touched on this question quite a lot now.
I did a private member's bill, the Children's Food Bill, when I was first newly elected in 2005, and it was all about getting junk food vending machines out of schools, minimum nutritional standards for school dinners, but also putting cooking and growing lessons onto the national curriculum. And by 2008, all of those things had happened. So at Key Stage 3, between the ages of 11 and 14, everybody in the national curriculum does get cooking and growing skills as part of what they do. And many supermarkets like Morrison's have got a big Let's Grow campaign where they work with local schools as well, community allotments. I think actually it's as Jay says, the paradox is if you're in the city, teachers actually try harder perhaps than in rural areas, because where the lands and the fields are all around, to actually educate children about those about where their food comes from and how to cook it well. And certainly we're seeing it with food co-ops, community food co-ops, where there's community cafes growing up and where you have volunteers coming in. I spoke to one young woman in Wakefield, it was about a year ago now, and she'd come in, she had a massive weight problem, and by going to a community cafe and learning how to cook healthily, she'd lost about 6 stone and was now teaching and cooking other people, other young mums about how to eat healthily and how to eat cheaply with their families.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask David Verney and Arthur Hill to come and to ask their questions? But let me ask now David Fluellen to...
Can I thank you first for letting Millie ask a question? It was,
yeah, I'm sorry, Millie, because I thought your question was going to be just the same. So thank you, because you made some good points.
Good. Mine is slightly different. I'm David Llewellyn from Harper Adams University College. And I just want to say that we've heard an awful lot over the last 24 hours about the need for research and development, but not much really about the delivery of applied agricultural research and knowledge transfer. And those limited number of places now able to do this, given the way in which applied research has been run down really over the last 10 to 15 years. But in particular, can the panel give us their view as to the relative priority currently and in the future that should be given to agricultural engineering and precision farming as opposed to the biosciences, and getting those advanced technologies out into practice in the farming sector, where agricultural engineering has an awful lot to deliver in our view, to both production and the management of the environment.
Sean, do you want to just answer that one?
I'm very much in agreement with that. One of the issues really since the beginning of the 1990s is that Europe came to believe, and still believes I think in some respects, that the problem of food production had been solved and it's been going in a different direction. And what we really need now is a new green revolution. We need a revolution that brings together the best of science and technology with farmers and government policy to deliver a more efficient, a more high-tech, a more advanced agricultural industry. And I think it's just going back to the last question, one of the things we need to do is educate people to understand the importance of things like biotechnology, which is going to rule this industry in a few years' time. Biotechnology, nanotechnology, and of course precision agriculture, they go together. They're expensive to introduce on the farm. They need large farms, highly skilled people with the money to invest in these things. And yes, I'm with you. I think we've got to stand on our heads. We've got to stop paying people for doing things which are not very helpful, and we've got to use public money to invest in science and technology to deliver more fruits for us in the future.
Jay,
I said something last year, and I'm going to repeat it again. One of the things that ill-serves everybody in this room is the state of British food media, too much of which is obsessed with small-scale and artisanal, where, you know, it's knit your own yogurt and girls in Dirndl milking the goats. And it has more in common, I think the products of that industry, although it's lovely, has more in common with selling Chanel handbags than it does with actually selling food on a mass scale. I get this slot on the one show where I get to go onto farms and show how food is produced. You guys, I said this last year, I'll say it again, you need to do better PR for agriculture in Britain to show exactly what it's about, how important it is, and that it's not really just about tiny, small holdings, that it's an industry, it's a technological industry, and it needs to be as advanced as it possibly can if it's going to achieve that goal. But a lot of that argument needs to be made by you to get that argument across. Go on if you want to.
Applaud him. Applaud him. You can't come back next year and say the same thing 3 years running. Well, you might have to. You might
I've only got a few tunes here till Tuesday.
But Jim, what about this? I mean, the whole area of R&D, I mean, a lot of people have been very critical about the fact that not enough money has been spent on that in the last few years, and that's what's gone wrong.
Well, it's entirely right, and David's entirely right to have made the point he has, and it has been in long-term decline, and frankly, I'm not going to try to explain or justify that. I wasn't responsible for it, but what matters is not what's happened in the past, but how we put it right now. As Caroline Spellman said yesterday, we welcome one of the bits we welcome in the CAP proposals is a substantial increase in funding for research and innovation. That's very important. But also we need, as David said, to move it closer to the farmer, both in terms of the applied science and the knowledge transfer to get actually the research developments into the field. And that is something that my colleague John Taylor, Lord Taylor of Holbeach, is really grasping. He did some work with us in research, and he's taking it forward now, working in opposition on this issue, and he's now taking that forward since he's joined the team in DEFRA, because we really need to concentrate on it, and we're looking at how we can dramatically improve the whole advisory approach delivered by government, which is a bit of a mishmash. We haven't got it right yet. To improve on that so that we can get the knowledge and the information into the field as soon as possible so that farmers can benefit from it. The other point, though, is this issue, and Jay is right, that there's a huge amount the industry needs to do in order to demonstrate to the public that this is a very professional, experienced, responsible industry, attractive, and actually in most cases delivering pretty good terms of employment these days. But we need to raise that profile and demonstrate that it is attractive to all sorts of people for a very good lifestyle and reward.